Hello and welcome to a special interview for VIT today. We have with us Mr. Rajdeep Sardesai. Sir is a famous news anchor and also known and as well-known author. He's a consulting editor for the India Today Group and one of our favorite faces on in television and in the news. So I want to start this interview by getting your take on somewhat of a debated topic in India is the freedom of press. As a journalist who's been in the field for nearly 3 decades, what's your what is your take on the current situation in the freedom of expression and the freedom of press in our country?
I was looking, first of all, thank you very much for having me here, Sarthak and Dipali. It's good to be here, particularly Independence Day. So happy Independence Day to all of you.
Independence Day, sir.
Look, it's a good day on which to talk about freedom and press freedom. We are ranked actually about 120 at the moment in the world as per a particular press freedom index. Now, that may not necessarily be accurate in the fullest term, because some of the countries ahead of us in that index are authoritarian regimes. But I think it does reflect the fact that we still have a long way to go. The fact is that, as was once famously said, the press is free but still remains in chains. Notionally, we are a free press as we are a free country. But there are pressures, let's be honest. I think all of us are today increasingly, particularly in the mainstream media, looking over our shoulders to see what government will do, won't do. I think the pressures have increased because the dependence on government advertising is growing, especially for the smaller newspapers and network, or dare I say even the larger ones. I think that's, I think across the board, dependence on government advertising to sustain business models is increasing. I do believe that there are various pressure groups now that operate that, in a sense, try at least to dictate terms to meet the media. Much like society, the media also today is polarized, and that polarization also creates its own sort of us versus them difficulties and constricts freedom. So I think freedom in different forms. Governments use FIRs to browbeat and intimidate journalists. Governments will use advertising power. Governments are known to have silenced journalists in different forms. I don't mean necessarily, unlike, say, the authoritarian regime where a gun may be put to your head. Yeah, there are other ways to silence journalists. So I think dissent, the space for dissent, to my mind, is shrinking. Particularly in the mainstream media, there are fewer and fewer people who are willing to take the risks that are involved in taking on any government. And to that extent, this could be a state government or the central government. So you're right. I think we are less free today, sadly, than perhaps we were at the start of independence in 47.
Yes, sir, a little follow-up on something which you mentioned while you were speaking with respect to journalists. So many a times we've seen that, multiple journalists have been criticized for their style of reporting per se, right? So because of the limitation, like you mentioned, that does exist in today's world, sir, is there any possible change that you would like to bring forth, some way in the, say, the policy or probably in the grassroots level that might solve this problem and give a little more freedom to journalists that they do deserve, sir?
Look, there are no easy solutions here. I think the business model of journalism itself is under strain. Digital doesn't have a revenue model. Television, the market is getting more and more fragmented. The same advertising power is being chased by hundreds of news channels. And print, like it or not, is also unable to grow anymore. It is facing a sort of plateauing. So the plateauing of print, the fragmentation of TV, and the lack of a visible model for digital is creating a situation where the dependence of the media on external forces, whether it's corporates, whether it's government, is growing. Truly, the solution lies in philanthropy, in my view. We need to create spaces for genuine philanthropy or genuine public broadcasting. Unfortunately, Doordarshan failed to play the role of a public broadcaster, and most corporates who enter Indian media don't enter it with philanthropic zeal. They enter it for control, for access, for power. And those are the wrong reasons, in my view, to be entering the media business. So I think, on both sides, the two principal players, the state and private sector, haven't done enough really to create a sustainable, long-term, credible, journalistic driven media model.
Right, sir. So, my next question tries to tackle a bit between the transparency between people and government itself, right? Now, drawing a parallel between our Western counterparts with no country specifically, we see that governments have a proper media wing in the sense that they have reporters who have a little more access to their leaders, and you see more daily briefings coming from the government's end. So, due to popular culture, we probe privy to the White House, and we see how in the media culture in White House is developed. We have White House reporters, etc. We see that lacking in an Indian media context, right? We don't see that much transparency. We don't know, the Prime Minister doesn't give a daily briefing. I'm not aware if somebody from the staff does, but we see that lacking in our country in a sense. What's your comment on this lack of construct in our country?
Sarthak, you are talking about a lack of a daily briefing. The Prime Minister hasn't done a press conference in 6 years as Prime Minister, and I don't think he did anything in the last 10 years as Gujarat Chief Minister. So I think a culture has been built in, and I'm not saying it's any different on the other side. Sonia Gandhi, who's been the longest serving Congress president, I don't recall whether she's taken maybe one over 20 years of a kind of an open Q&A, but not really open. I interviewed her once, and then just before the interview, I was told no political questions, which meant that the interview had to be about all things but politics, about her relationship with her mother-in-law, Indira Gandhi, which was a bit embarrassing for me as well as I think for the viewer. But look, the fact is we haven't built a culture which I would call as adversarial, as interrogative, where questions can be posed. And this is not just true of our politicians. Increasingly, it's true of cricketers who are surrounded by their PR agents. Therefore, you can't ask them tough questions. It's true of Bollywood, which is part of a larger PR machinery. It's true of corporate India. They'll hold their AGMs, but rarely will they be subject to questioning from their shareholders. I think the entire ecosystem in India is not by its nature adversarial and questioning. And our politicians have got away. And then because we are in an age of these new forms of technology, you can circumvent the media. The Prime Minister can talk directly to the country using Twitter, as do most politicians today. So you don't need he's using radio very creatively in his Mann Ki Baat. Why does he then need the media? If I can talk directly to my voter, then I don't need the media. The whole role of the media was to tell truth to power. But by eliminating us and going directly to the people, you are effectively rendering us almost infructuous. Why do I need the media? So I think it is peculiar. I think America is a good example of a democracy where the First Amendment of free speech is genuinely taken seriously. Its value. I don't think it's as valued here, unfortunately. And that's why there's been this sort of belief that you can get away without having to answer these questions.
Sir, in the essence of democracy and elections itself, open conversations or politicians giving out their opinions before elections takes place is something which is very crucial for the people of the country to know about what they are standing for or what their stance is in a particular election. So do you think that a country like India can have a similar model? And not just that, if India adopts such a model, are open conversations a good platform for voicing out stances for politicians?
No, I think open conversation would be great, and I think the focus has to be on open, not one way. See, the problem with a lot of the conversations that take place today, they're increasingly one way. Technology allows, as I said earlier, through Twitter, through Facebook, through these great big open source platforms, allows the leader to directly connect with his or her voter, but does it in a manner that there is no two-way dialogue. Very rarely is there a two-way dialogue. And I think open source conversations require first an openness of mind. The willingness is, it comes back again to that, what kind of a society are you? Are you by your very nature a society that is interrogative, which is adversarial, or are you a feudal old style society which sees the state as my bar? So I think that to my mind is the problem. So I think I think you've got to recognize that the state itself is unwilling to embrace this sort of two-way process. And unless the state is able to embrace a two-way process, wherein it recognizes that the citizen also deserves to be heard. It's not just enough to have a right to, one of your rights should be the right to be heard. I mean, the right to information to some extent created that, gave people a sense that, maybe they could ask questions of the state. But the kind of open source conversation that you're speaking about requires a higher level of accountability, a higher level of being willing to be subject to questioning. I would love to see that India, but I don't see it happening in the near future.
Right, sir. But okay, so taking it down a notch, perhaps if we could compare in a format of a debate between two political parties, right? We usually see political party A talking about political party B, but in two different events. But we see that happen openly in other elections, whether open debates moderated by famous TV anchors such as yours. Now, taking that model, which is not probably as open as we would want it to be, taking that model into consideration, why has something like this never been tried in India? And if it has been tried, why has it not been successful?
Good question. Look, at the end of the day, the US is an open society. As I said, they give a primacy to the notion of free speech. So stemming from that comes the idea of being held accountable by the people. Stemming from that comes the idea of a presidential debate where questions can be freely put. I have attempted it in this country several times. I have written, I remember, I think, I don't know which election it was, but I think I wrote to both I know I wrote to Sheila Dikshit and Arvind Kejriwal in the Delhi elections of 2013, no go. I attempted it and partially successful. Digvijay versus Uma Bharti, I think was 2003, Madhya Pradesh. Last minute, Uma Bharti backed out and Arun Jaitley replaced her. We've tried this in a couple of state elections, but increasingly, and even then it was a difficult task, now it's virtually impossible. Because the politician in this country is a Raja or a Maharaja or Maharani. You see, the attitude comes from them as feudal lords. So if you're a feudal lord or lady, then you're not willing to subject yourself to the Janta's questions. The very idea of pitting yourself against you always even believe your rival is below you. How do you get, I remember Sheila Dikshit that time saying, why should I do it with Kejriwal? Who is Kejriwal? Even though he was the opposition contender at the time. I'm sure Modi will say that Modi versus Rahul would be great TV. I'd love to do it. I'd love to host it. Rahul Gandhi keeps saying, I believe that, I'm ready to debate with Mr. Modi anytime, any place. They've tried, Parliament used to be a forum for this to some extent and remains so. But, it's never really been done also again in that hard interrogative style. So even Parliament leaves a lot to be desired. Very few. There was a time, if you look at India's Parliament debates of 50s, 60s, even till the 70s, a lot of hard debate took place inside Parliament. That is also becoming less and less. Even Parliament is no longer a space in which the kind of debate that you are talking about can be held. So forget about TV channels. So all we are left with is party spokespersons, who will shout at each other, name call, personalize it, which is, less than satisfying.
Right, sir. So, moving on to a probably solution-oriented question, do you think there's a certain wave of change coming from the rather younger leaders? Like, we probably take into premise the fact that, the older leaders are of a certain type and they probably can't approach them for such endeavors, but the younger generation of leaders, Mr. Tejasvi Surya, Kanhaiya Kumar, the new generation, so to say, Ms. Poonam Mahajan, do you see a certain amount of change in the way they approach? Because they do talk about a more progressive India. They talk about a few progressive issues, as they mostly contest from more progressive cities or more progressive districts. But do you think that a certain amount of change can be expected from these new generation of leaders?
These two questions.
That's a very good question, because I would expect that a generational change would bring about a change in that the younger generation would be much more willing to engage. Some of them are, the Tejasvi Suryas of the world are a little bit more willing than perhaps leaders of a previous generation to sort of at least come out on TV and sort of come on a stage, speak live. But the overwhelming political culture is such that Kanhaiya Kumar, Tejasvi, these will be exceptions. They won't be the rule. You see, politicians now realize that how you debate on TV or how you debate in parliament doesn't make a difference to your voter. See, there is a disconnect also with what the voter wants. The voter is not voting for you because how well you speak on TV. Voter is voting for you on a myriad other objective or subjective factors which have nothing to do with your ability to take questions. Ability to, I may be looking at this sort of democratic ideal where my netas will take all my questions. The voter is much more transactional. He wants to know, mujhe kya milega? What is it in it for me? And I think that's where money, power, and the sort of quid pro quos that come with your vote is almost exchanged as a sort of in return for certain favors. And also the rise of community and caste identities has meant that electoral democracy no longer needs debating skills as a necessary qualification to become an MP, MLA, legislator, panchayat leader, anything.
Right, sir. But if I were to pick out examples, like probably not the next generation, but let's say a generation above Mr. Scindia or Mr. Pilot, they are more outspoken than certain other leaders are, right? And they're certainly not outliers because they are the next generation of leaders our country expects them to be. And they have been vocal, in fact, with recent actions, clearly vocal about how they were unhappy and unsatisfied by what roles they were given. So my question perhaps indicates to the fact that do you think that these are the leaders that should probably take up that ownership, seeing that they have a safer go at politics because of whatever reasons, because of the family they belong to or the relationship they have with their voters already, and at the same time they are from a younger generation. Do you think these are the leaders who are expected to make that change?
Actually, I'll tell you something. While I do believe that younger leaders are more communicative in many ways or more au fait with technology, frankly, the older leaders used to be, now that I think of it, when I started a program called Big Fight about 20 years ago in NDTV, people of top quality would come. Pranab Mukherjee, Kashi Ram, Arun Shauri, Pramod Mahajan, Narendra Modi himself. The last debate Narendra Modi has done was on my program, 2001 September, on 9/11. He's never after that come on a program. You see, I think what happens is as you rise up the political ladder, then you feel you are no longer accountable and answerable. Today, Scindia and Sachin Pilot are at a stage, perhaps in their political career, where they feel the necessity to be ready to take questions or come in debates. I don't know whether they would do that 10 years from now if they were, top ministers or prime ministers of the country. I just feel, as I said, the ecosystem, the political culture of this country is such that it makes it, it's not very conducive to this kind of democratic culture of questioning. Let me be also honest. Many of our politicians don't have a thick skin, the younger ones. So the moment you criticize them, they back off. The older generation politicians had a much thicker skin. They were ready to take criticism. Today, most politicians, like society, are becoming intolerant. They will only take questions that suit them. There were earlier generation politicians never asked you for a questionnaire or what do you want to speak about. Today, with a few exceptions, and Mr. Pilot is an exception. I interviewed him 3-4 days ago after his revolt sort of went off the boil, and he didn't tell me, don't ask this, don't ask that. But a lot of other politicians over the years, they will only take questions from journalists whom they are comfortable with. That was never the case 20 years ago. I could question a Vajpayee ji. As Prime Minister, he would call me in and I could question him. And I miss that. I've done about half a dozen interviews with Mr. Vajpayee inside the Prime Minister's residence. Dr. Manmohan Singh was reluctant, and Mr. Modi has completely closed the door.
So I'll just ask one more question, and then we can have your concluding remarks and finish the interview. So
Sure.
you recently talked about the suppression of dissent, especially in Kashmir, and how it violates the tenets of a democracy. Now, preparing for this question, I came across an interesting debate with Mr. Sitaram Yechury and Baijan Panda in the Oxford Union, I ironically, you also belong to the Oxford University. Now, my question stands on the fact that irrespective of Mr. Sitaram Yechury's arguments, Mr. Baijan Panda made it very clear saying that now Kashmir is liable to the democracy of India, which means that there is no child marriage is illegal. The LGBTQ rights are acceptable in Kashmir, which was something which was not applicable to Kashmir before this Article 370 came into action. Taking that into context, do you still stand with the statement that you made, and would you like to clarify where you stand on this entire issue?
Look, to my mind, the debate over Article 370 has been falsely posed. Article 370 is not the reason for the crisis in Kashmir, for the conflict in Kashmir. Article 370 was meant to go years ago. And Article 370 did create an unequal relationship in a sense between Srinagar and the rest of the country. No doubt, no one doubts that. That, you can't, beyond the point, have separate rights, privileges, perhaps that other parts of the country have. However, because of successive failures of government to achieve genuine integration, or because of the flawed manner in which the entire process of partition took place, Kashmir was a festering wound. And therefore, over the years, the conflict has been allowed to fester. Now, to suggest that in that environment, to withdraw Article 370, which was and reduce Kashmir to a union territory significantly, is, to my mind, not addressing the root of the problem. The root of the problem is not Article 370. I have no problem. You want to scrap Article 370, please go ahead, do it. But then what you need to put in place is a structure that recognizes Kashmiris also as equals. You say today that, yes, LGBT rights or child marriage legislation which is applicable to the rest of the country is applicable to Kashmir. Good. But along with that, when is the last time that a state is reduced to a union territory, albeit temporarily, as the government says? When do you have a situation where so many political workers have been detained for such an extended period of time? And at the same time, it is also true that which other state has witnessed 25 years of this kind of militancy? So I think Kashmir needs to be taken as a special case. And in that special case situation, the withdrawal of Article 370 overnight, the relegation of a state from statehood to union territory sends out the wrong message. It doesn't send out the message that I treat Kashmiris equally. Instead, it sends out the message that I can do what I want now because I've got a majority in the rest of the country. Please withdraw Article 370, but do it through a process of involvement with the political leadership of the state. Please ensure equal rights and citizens and privileges for its citizens. But you can't do that by reducing a state to a union territory. So I think the fundamental problem of Kashmir is alienation of its people. There is a sense of alienation. And as I said, much of this has to do with the legacy of partition. We could argue the whole notion of a Muslim majority state, whether it really felt truly, particularly the valley. And I actually believe we should now, first of all, I've always believed in trifurcation at some level. Kashmir Valley, Jammu and Ladakh need to be treated separately. Right? Not
Right,
as
sir.
necessarily a union. I think that each of these regions needs a different approach. You need a different approach to Kashmir Valley, you needed a different approach to Jammu and a different approach to Ladakh. One size doesn't fit all. Article 370 to that extent, to my mind, frankly, most Kashmiris couldn't care whether it's gone or there. They want the real issue, as long as they get a sense of identity. I think the Kashmiri issue today is now linked fundamentally to notions of political identity. And that won't be resolved by scrapping Article 370. It's not linked to citizenship, it's linked to political identity.
Right, sir. So, concluding this interview, I just wanted to, since the Prime Minister gave a speech today morning on the occasion of Independence Day, I'll be glad if you could conclude on that note, probably give us a few remarks on what you thought about that speech. And yeah, there'll probably be a concluding. I think that we can't conclude on a better note today.
Look, I think the best thing about this Prime Minister is that he's a bit of a trendsetter. He not just in the way he's of course theatrical in his sort of oratory, and likes to wear the right safa to define the sort of spirit of the times, and he's a passionate speaker. But more than that, I think trendsetter in the sense that he picks up issues that are taboo. In a way, for a Prime Minister today to stand up on the ramparts of Red Fort and speak so passionately about women's hygiene, menstruation for the longest time has been a taboo subject. So for the Prime Minister to speak about sanitary napkins, sanitary pads from the ramparts of Red Fort, I think sends out a very powerful message. And I think that is Mr. Narendra Modi's strength, whether it was Swachh Bharat or whether, from toilet cleaning and toilet building to today talking about sanitary napkins. These are issues, I believe, that needed to be part of the public discourse. And I sort of congratulate the Prime Minister for putting it up there in the public discourse. Where I have my problems with the Prime Minister at times, a lot of his speeches are about buzzwords, are about, making claims that may not always materialize on the ground. So, it's very nice to say Atmanirbhar Bharat again and again. It's a lovely word, but it needs flesh and blood. My friends who are in small scale industry, or I know people in informal sector who COVID has completely sort of set back by years, as did demonetization. For them, what is Atmanirbhar Bharat but just a catchword? You have to make it easier to do business. So I think that's the weak point. There are sometimes a lot of nice buzzwords that don't translate into reality on the ground. The strong point, I think, is that he does touch upon issues that others previously would reluctantly would not even refer to at gatherings like 15th August, and that enables him to strike a chord. That's the secret of his political communication. He's a terrific political communicator, and on occasions like this, he does raise his game. But look, a country is not about a prime minister. I keep maintaining a country as vast as India is about each and every one of us. So I think this is an occasion, if in conclusion I can say, to sort of restore a sense of civic citizen nationalism, much more than any other form of nationalism, which puts citizen first. You as students, me as a professional, someone else, our rights and freedoms must be respected at all costs, and we in turn must respect the constitutional framework that guarantees us those rights. And I think if each of us is able to play the role of a good citizen, we can build a great country. This is still the most remarkable country in the world, most remarkably diverse. There's no other country in the world I would do journalism at least, because India is a country like no other. You never know what tomorrow brings, and that's why I think that to my mind sort of is a thought to leave you all with. That let's sort of respect our diversity. Let's live, love, laugh together, not trapped in caste, community, political party agendas. Let's bridge divides.
Right, sir. So on that note, I think thank you so much for being with us today. I think it was really lovely to have a conversation.
My great pleasure. And Deepakar, thank you. Thank you both.
So much, sir.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Okay, I have one request. I hope that all your students will pick up my new book, 2019, How Modi Won India. So I'm going to give a bit of a plug to the book. So please make sure that all your VIT guys pick up the book. It's now available
Sure, sir.
Absolutely,
at a
sir.
discount on Amazon.